Well, good evening, darlin'. Pull up a chair and let me pour us a fresh cup. Oh, don't mind that chipped floral china. It's older than both of us together. Something about the way the steam curls out of it tonight, carrying that faint whiff of Cody Lamont and last summer gardenias, just plucked a memory straight from the attic of my mind and set it humming like the first notes of Patsy Cline drifting through the screen door. And while you're settling in, takes only a breath, sweetheart. Go on and tap that little thumbs up button or scribble me a note below. Bless your heart. That tiny kindness keeps this porch light burning so I can visit with you again. There, that wasn't so painful, was it? Now, where was I? Yes, the scent. Funny how a smell can rattle the lock on a door you thought was welded shut. One moment, I'm a 79-year-old widow straightening picture frames in my Virginia sitting room. The next, I'm Lois May Whitaker, 28, standing in my mother-in-law's kitchen in Summerfield, South Carolina, 1974, holding this very cup between careful fingers while Margaret Ann watches like a Sunday school hawk. The July heat clung to us like wet linen that day, ceiling fan wheezing overhead, psalms murmured from the living room radio, and my own heart beat louder than the cicadas outside. Folks remember that summer for gasoline lines and tornadoes, but I remember it for the taste of nettle and nickel at the back of my tongue and the way David, my husband then, refused to meet my eyes whenever his mama poured the tea. I reckon some memory still fades so much as steep, growing darker, stronger, until one morning you lift the lid and the bitterness just about knocks you over. All these years later, I can still feel that first flutter of dizziness, like my soul taking one cautious step away from my body to see if the floor was safe, and I can still hear Margaret Ann's polite drawl floating over the brim. "Drink up, Lois May. It's good for what ails you." Lord have mercy, I believed her, or maybe I wanted to. You see, back then I was a schoolteacher who thought Emily Dickinson held answers to every riddle of the heart, who wore neat pleated skirts and pinned my hopes on quiet domestic afternoons, who kept telling myself that if I practiced enough Southern grace, I'd earn a place in that family pew. But the body keeps its own counsel, and mine whispered through tremors and forgotten sentences that something unholy was seeping into my bloodstream. Each breath tasted of copper patience. Tonight, as the crickets start their twilight chorus and the porch boards settle under the weight of memory, that same warning hum returns, gentle yet insistent, reminding me why the story refuses to stay buried. It isn't the cruelty that haunts me. Heaven knows life dishes out sharper sorrows. It's the hush, the conspiracy of polite smiles and bowed heads that let the poison slip past. So, if you'll indulge an old lady for the span of a single song, I'll unlace the ribbon around that summer and show you what was hidden beneath the Sunday hats and embroidered handkerchiefs. But before I do, I want you to ask yourself, if the person pouring your tea looked you dead in the eye and wished you blessings, would you taste the difference between devotion and danger? Sit with that, honey, and let me know down in the comments, because by the time this tale is through, you might just check your own cup twice. Now if I close my eyes, just for a spell, honey, I'm back on Sullivan Street, barefoot on Daddy's cool pine floor, breathing in Murphy oil soap and blackberry cobbler the way some folks breathe prayers. Summers in tiny Summerfield, South Carolina, rolled by like a slow hymn. Roosters crowed the sun up, magnolia and river mist sweetened the air, cicadas tuned their fiddles by noon, and evenings folded over a soft as a church quilt while the First Baptist bell tolled 6. Mama propped our windows open with dog-eared poetry books, and the breeze flipped their pages like wings. I was just Lois May Givens then, pigtails, skin knees, pockets full of fireflies, certain kindness ran the world the way water runs downhill. Daddy preached that goodness always circles back, and I believed him the way I believed lightning bugs were bits of heaven that got lost. By high school, I'd swapped marbles for Emily Dickinson, reading her lines aloud to the pines because they never teased a girl for dreaming. I pictured my future simple, Chalk dust on a gingham skirt, a neat clapboard house, a husband who said grace slow, maybe a baby that smelled of talc and sunshine. College sat 2 counties over, but I sped there in Mama's borrowed Ford, Patsy Cline crackling on the AM dial, heart puffed up like a Sunday hat. I studied literature the way my friends chased boys, underlining every sentence that thumped. Then David Whitaker walked into the library, calculated smile, accountant's eyes, and told me numbers were just stories that added up. I mistook that hush in him for depth. Our courting was all soda fountain malts and front porch promises. His mama, Margaret, and often sat beside us, hands folded so tight the knuckles paled. I told myself her watchfulness was love. When David proposed, the church filled with azaleas, and I walked the aisle believing marriage was a forever that maintained itself once spoken. For years later I was Mrs. Whitaker, teaching 9th grade English, penciling red notes on awkward poems, packing David's bologna sandwiches in wax paper, ironing his shirts to please Margaret, and who crossed our lawn each afternoon with her famous sweet potato pie and a critique tucked under her tongue. Still, I held tight to the lesson Daddy planted: show kindness and it will bloom right back. I kept thinking if I baked enough casseroles and nodded in the right places, her smile would reach her eyes. Routine felt like proof of righteousness. Psalms on Sunday, meatloaf Monday, quilt guild Tuesday, prayer circle Wednesday. So I ignored the little quiets between David and me, the way his laughter stopped just short of his eyes, the way Margaret N's blessings sounded like orders. At 28, I believed optimism could render a soul bulletproof. Heartache happened, sure, but surely 2 streets over to folks who forgot to say grace. Nobody told me some seeds sprout hemlock no matter how gentle the gardener, or that people sometimes leave kindness unanswered like an unreturned library book. On warm nights, I pictured myself gray-haired on a porch swing, David beside me, Margaret and cooing grandbabies to sleep, and thought the future looked steady as the North Star. Funny how heart can be full and hollow at once, full of bright intentions, hollow where warning ought to lodge. Child, I can still feel that younger self standing tiptoe at the edge of her life, eyes wide, believing every road led safely home. She's about to lift a teacup for the first time in her mother-in-law's kitchen. She has no idea what price that sip will carry. Not yet, but the night air was already thick with secrets, and if you listened close you could almost hear the sigh of a door settling closed behind her. It happened on a humming hot Thursday near the tail end of August 74, the sort of day when the sun sits heavy over Summerfield like a watchful aunt and the air tastes faintly of boiled peanuts. School let out after lunch for faculty planning, so I meandered home under a sky the color of pressed linen, clutching my grade book and humming Stand By Your Man. Coming up the walk I saw Margaret and Whitaker planted on my porch as prim as Sunday china, a lace handkerchief folded over her arm, and here's the odd thing, one lone teacup cradled in both hands. I'd never glimpsed that cup before, bone white, rimmed in gold filigree, with tiny purple violets climbing the bowl like shy secrets. Lois May, she called, voice sweet as sorghum yet sharp enough to slice cornbread. I brought you a little something special. She raised the cup the way a pastor lifts the chalice, and before I could set my books down she pressed it into my palms. The porcelain felt cool despite the heat, almost steely, and for one flicker of a heartbeat I thought I heard wind chimes though there were none in sight. A lady ought to have her own cup, she went on, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from her skirt. A private comfort. Brew this blend when you're needing calm. I thanked her well, manners first, and she followed me into the kitchen, unwrapping a small tin of loose tea from that lace square. The leaves smelled floral, with a curious metallic whisper beneath, but I chalked it up to the tin. She warmed the kettle, humming, How Great Thou Art, and chattered about the women's circle bake sale while I watched the steam curl, silver ribbons against the window light. When the tea steeped dark amber, she poured just for me, no cup for herself, then folded her hands as though waiting on revelation. I lifted it, and right then my pulse gave a funny skip, like a record catching on a hymn. The taste wasn't unpleasant, soft lavender with a penny's edge, yet some part of me, the woodland quick part Daddy called a truth finder, stirred uneasy. Still, Margaret N's eyes pinned me gentle and expectant, and what bride wants to disappoint her husband's mama? So I smiled and drank. A warm flutter spread through my chest, pleasant at first, but as the second swallow slid down I felt an odd shimmer, as if the kitchen floor had risen half an inch. In that same moment David came through the back door, loose in tie, ledger tucked under his arm. Margaret N greeted him with a pat on the cheek and said, "Your wife's trying my special calming blend, keeps a home peaceful." David's glance grazed the cup, then drifted away like he'd rehearsed indifference. My heart marked that look, stored it beside the strange taste. Evening settled violet over the fields. Margaret N kissed my forehead, promised a fresh batch tomorrow, and glided home across the lawn. I set the cup on the sill, meaning to wash it later, yet something in the fading light made the violet seem to pulse, tiny purple warnings beating time. Crawling into bed, I asked David what was in the tea. He adjusted his spectacles and muttered, "Just herbs, honey. Mama knows best," then rolled away without another breath. I lay awake while the ceiling fan clacked and the first night crickets tuned up, listening to my own heartbeat tap out questions I couldn't name. My fingertips tingled, my mind drifted woolly, but one truth glowed bright as a firefly trapped in a mason jar. A single gift, delivered with perfect politeness, had nudged my world an inch off center, and everything after, every word, every silence, would spin around that porcelain rim. I couldn't have told you why yet, but I knew in my bones that cup wasn't comfort, it was a door, and I'd just stepped through. Morning after morning that autumn I woke before the rooster, head ringing like a misstruck bell and stomach turning slow circles, yet I still buttoned my gingham dress, packed David's ledger lunch, and walked to school with a smile stitched too tight, because in Summerfield a wife who can't keep her household running is whispered about quicker than rain on a tin roof. 3 sips of Margaret N's calming blend had become a daily obligation. She appeared at my door by 4 o'clock, pressed the cup into my trembling hands, and watched until the last drop slipped past my lips, quoting proverbs about obedience, as though each verse were a thread binding me to the chair. I tried to believe it was only nerves, maybe the stress of lesson plans and Margaret N's constant inspections, but the dizziness grew bolder, blooming behind my eyes like dark peonies, and sometimes in the classroom the blackboard letters wavered as if a river ran between me and my students. One Tuesday I collapsed against the bookcase while reciting Dickinson, chalk scattering like startled doves, and the school nurse, Mary Ellen Cromwell, hustled me into the infirmary. She took one look at the pallor under my Coty Rouge, listened to my list of aches, metal taste, weak pulse, fogged memory, and said, "Low and urgent, Lois, these ain't the flu. You ever been around copper sulfate? Arsenic?" Her words skittered across my mind like dry leaves. Respectable wives weren't poisoned, not in real life and certainly not by kin. I laughed it off, but the laugh tasted like pennies. That evening I mentioned the nurse's concern to David over meatloaf, and he tightened his jaw till it clicked, said Mary Ellen read too many mystery novels, and perhaps I ought to rest more instead of teaching those moody poets. Shame washed through me. How dare I doubt the family God gave me? Yet the shame wrestled with a rising fear that flopped louder each time Margaret N crossed my threshold. After supper David disappeared to the basement to check the water heater. Though no repairman was called, the hush downstairs felt thick, secretive, and when I reached the landing I caught fragments of their argument. Margaret Ann's hiss, "Dosage must be smaller." She's noticing, and David's weary growl, "We can't keep this up, Mama." My heart surged so hard I thought it might climb my throat. I crept back up before the floorboards tattled, but every good girl instinct cracked like cheap china. The next Sunday at church, I knelt beside David, mouth forming hymns while my spirit howled, and I searched the congregation for a friendly face, yet found only polite smiles floating over hymnals, none wise to the battleground inside my ribcage. Could I confide in Mary Ellen? In the pastor? In my own sister 2 states away? To accuse one's husband and his revered mother of foul play was to invite scandal big enough to stain generations. Women in our county had been labeled hysterical for far less. Still, the bruised fatigue in my bones whispered I might not live long enough to worry about talk. So I stood at the crossroads of silence and survival, one road paved with reputation, the other with raw, terrifying truth. And every time the teacup touched my lips, the choice pressed harder, until even the clink of porcelain sounded like a ticking clock counting down to a decision only I could make. That night the heavens cracked open with a Carolina thunderboomer fit to wake the bones of the righteous, and every window pane in our clapboard shivered like it knew a secret was about to split wide. I lay pinned beneath a fevered quilt, the metallic taste thick as solder on my tongue, when a clap of lightning lit the hallway, and I caught the silhouette of Margaret and gliding toward the kitchen, robe cinched, hair set neat as Sunday curls. Something in that pale flash, maybe the way her shadow never hurried, poured cold resolve through my veins, so I rose, steadying myself against the wall, and followed in stocking feet. The house smelled of wet earth and lavender, thunder rolling low outside like God clearing his throat. From the kitchen door I saw her turn the dim stove light, lift my violet-rimmed teacup, rub the rim with a cloth as tender as a lullaby, then open a little cobalt bottle I had never seen. She tipped 3 white grains, no more than pinheads, into the cup, humming nearer, my God, to thee as though preparing communion. My pulse thudded hurricane hard, but I held my breath when another figure eased into view. David, barefoot, shirt open at the throat, eyes hollow as storm gutters. "Mama," he whispered, "it's working too fast." She nearly fainted in class again. Margaret Ann's voice floated calm, almost kind. "That's the Lord's will moving, son. A weak vessel is easiest to mend." David's shoulders sagged like a scarecrow after harvest. "I never wanted this." She touched his cheek. "She ain't the wife heaven intended for you. Once she's gone, we'll straighten things." Time kinked right there, like a clock spring snapping, and I felt the floor vanish beneath memory, future, everything. My husband, my covenant partner, the man who held my wedding vows in trembling hands, just stared at my death in a cup inside. A storm gust slammed the screen door and jolted me breathing again. The grief came first, a hot wave of mourning for a life I thought we shared. Then terror surged, wild and electric, telling my legs to run. But colder than either was the clarity ringing in my skull. If I stayed till dawn, I'd be an obituary clipped neat for the church bulletin. I backed away silent as a shadow, gathered my purse, school satchel, and the damp raincoat from the peg, then, Lord forgive my trembling courage, slid that poisoned teacup into the pocket like a relic, proof the world would need. Upstairs I scrawled a note for form's sake, gone to visit sister, though my hands shook so the ink puddled teardrops. Lightning flickered while I eased the front door open. The whole night smelled of new beginnings and grave dirt. As I stepped onto the porch, the walnut clock in the parlor struck 2, each chime a nail sealing the life I was leaving. Out on the gravel drive the rain kissed my face cool and clean, baptizing me into a future unimagined. I did not cry. The tears were somewhere deep, frozen behind shock. Instead I felt hollow, like a bell after the last toll, but within that emptiness a fierce ember glowed. I would live. I would not be the obedient ghost Margaret Ann designed. I walked to the highway, thunder rumbling farewell, flagged the first greyhound rumbling north, and never looked back until the tail lights blurred into dawn. In that bleak blue hour between night and sunrise I lost a husband, a home, and the last shreds of girlhood innocence, but I gained the raw, unshakable knowledge that sometimes survival is the most righteous prayer a woman can utter, and I whispered it with every mile the bus carried me away. The days that followed were hushed the way a church feels on Monday morning, the choir robes hanging empty, the scent of yesterday's lilies already turning. I rode that Greyhound clear through to Richmond, pressed my forehead to the fogged glass while cornfields slipped into pine forests and the sky traded thunder for a dull pewter ache. Nobody on that bus knew my name, and in that anonymity I found a strange, bruised comfort. Lois May Whitaker became just another tired woman clutching a rain-damp purse, heartbeat counting its blessings one cautious thump at a time. In Richmond, I rented a boarding house room off Carey Street, a place that smelled of mothballs and boiled cabbage, where the landlady asked no questions so long as rent appeared each Friday. I told her I was a widow passing through, and the lie tasted easier than my own name. Mornings I woke to the rattle of streetcars instead of roosters, wrapped my queasy stomach in saltines and weak coffee, then walked the riverfront in second-hand shoes while trying to stitch a future from frayed threads. For weeks the world felt muffled, as though thick cotton separated me from sound, laughter in cafes, bells from St. John's. Even the rush of the James River reached me dim and far away. Sometimes I'd fish the violet-rimmed cup from my suitcase, turn it in my hands, and feel a chill like pond water glide across my palms. I never drank from it again, but I could not throw it out, for it held the proof that what happened was real, not some fevered dream conjured by loneliness. Nights were worse. Sleep came late and fractured, haunted by Margaret Ann's hymn and the soft thunk of David's ledger closing. I'd jerk awake convinced a hand hovered inches from my throat, and I'd lie still till dawn bled gray through the curtains, promising myself that fear would lessen if I just kept breathing. Work saved me, in its modest way. I found a position shelving books at the public library. The hush between the aisles felt familiar, and touching spines of Dickinson and Whitman reminded me there was still language kinder than silence. Yet, even among paper and dust motes, I flinched when a patron stepped too close. Trust, once cracked, doesn't mend like china with glue, it mends like bone, aching in the rain long after the break. The biggest wound, truth be told, was not the poison, but the shattering of that childlike belief Daddy planted, that goodness circles back. I learned that sometimes goodness limps, sometimes it loses the path entirely, and a woman has to plant her own signposts if she hopes to see daylight. Little by little I pieced a life, a rented attic studio, evening classes at the community college, new friends who knew only what I offered. I left church pews for long river walks where I talked to the water instead of to heaven, because I wasn't sure heaven listened. Yet even there, under sycamore shade, I felt a thin thread of grace humming through the solitude, quiet proof that surviving itself was a kind of hymn. Years slid by like pages turned slow. The dizziness faded, though a brittle weariness lingered at my joints. Mary Ellen's stern voice echoed whenever I smelled lavender. And somewhere in that long hush I realized I was not the same woman who had boarded a bus in storm-soaked stockings. The dutiful wife was gone, and in her place stood someone tempered, wary, but unbroken, a woman who kept her own counsel and carried her own key. I was lonely, yes. Solitude settled over me like frost some evenings, but I was alive, and each sunrise that laid gold across the James felt like a whispered apology from the universe. I learned to sip only coffee, never tea, and when someone offered sweetness unasked, I weighed it first beneath the light. Yet, even after all the miles and calendar pages, if a stranger asked, "Ma'am, do you believe people come back to what they've sown?" I'd touch that hidden teacup through my handbag and answer, "Only if the soil's willing, and some soil remembers poison longer than seeds." Well, some years after I settled into that attic room by the river, I startled awake one spring morning to the sound of children's laughter drifting in through the open window. a chorus of bright hopes scuttling across the lawns outside. The sky wore that first pale blue hush before dawn, and I lay there listening, my heart fluttering the way it hadn't in decades. You see, I'd grown used to silence so heavy it pressed the breath from my lungs, so I nearly missed the moment light seeped back into my bones. It came in the shape of little Mary Grace, the landlady's granddaughter, a freckle-faced sprite who tripped into my life carrying a stack of overdue library books stamped with my old teller card. She tipped them into my lap like a gift of sunbeams, Dickinson and Twain, and a tattered volume of Frost, and asked if I might help her with an essay about resilience. The whisper of purpose stirred something inside me that had long been dormant, a faint but insistent hum reminding me I once believed in the power of words to redeem a soul. So I set aside my morning coffee, once bitter, always safe, and tea, well, tea had become an echo of that other life I'd unlearned to trust. I opened the books on my little desk by the window and listened to Mary Grace read aloud, her voice small but determined, tilting each line as though coaxing honey from a comb. In her eagerness, I recognized a flicker of my younger self, the rookie teacher who thought she could save the world one poem at a time. As I guided her through imagery and metaphor, I felt the lightness swell, cautious, yes, but undeniably there, like spring's first crocus pushing through frost-hardened earth. That afternoon, I found myself dusting off my old lesson plans, tweaking them into simple reading circles for neighborhood children. On Saturday mornings, I'd welcome them into the little room above the streetcar tracks, where I served lemonade in plain white china, and we read lines of Dickinson, pausing for questions and giggles and solemn nods. Word spread that the library teacher was offering free lessons, and soon a motley crew of kids gathered: the pastor's son, who struggled with letters; the laundress's boy, who swallowed grammar like it was medicine; even shy Miss Lila May, who nodded so little I feared she'd forgotten how. Each time I saw understanding dawn in their eyes, a thrill like warm rain soaked my soul, washing away the memory of that violet-rimmed cup and the hush that followed it. One late afternoon, as golden light pulled across the pages of Frost, Mary Grace asked if I'd ever written my own poems. My breath caught. I hadn't written a line since before Summerfield, but something in her expectant face urged me forward. So I reached for a tattered journal and scribbled a few shaky lines about poison in porcelain, about roads paved with betrayal, about a heart learning to taste hope again. My hand shook, but the tremor felt like life stirring, not fear. That evening I tucked the pages away, but I knew they belonged somewhere, perhaps in a school newsletter, perhaps in a letter to someone who'd care. From that small seed of creative courage grew more. I volunteered at the community center, reading stories to folks in the senior wing, reminding them that every chapter held promise. Their smiles, lined with years of sorrow and wisdom, mirrored my own cautious optimism. I began to believe that a woman scarred by poison and silence could still grow roots deep enough to anchor hope. The world outside still carried its share of shadow, I won't pretend otherwise, but inside those shared stories, whether plucked from Dickinson or born from my own trembling pen, I found a second chance at purpose. And so, if you ever wonder whether a soul battered by grief can find light again, I'll tell you, sometimes it takes the laughter of a child, the whisper of a turning page, or the brave ink of your own hand to remind you that spring follows even the coldest winter, and that resilience is the quiet force that carries us home. Well, honey, there came a morning when I woke to the smell of rain on pavement and felt something loosen inside my chest, like a latch finally clicking free after years stuck fast, and I knew in that moment I could no longer carry the weight of all those ghosts. I shuffled into my little parlor, perched the old violet-rimmed teacup on the oak desk, no longer trembling at its porcelain chill, and reached for the tattered journal where I'd poured out my fear and fury long ago. My hands didn't shake. Instead, they felt steady, as if guided by a gentle promise that the past was just that, the past, and that my future could be something better than a long echo of pain. I opened the journal to the first page, where I'd scribbled lines about betrayal and broken vows, and I let a single tear trace its path down my cheek, washing away the last of the anger that had made me smaller than I was meant to be. Then, with a breath that seemed to carry every prayer I'd whispered into the dark, I tore out each page and folded it into the teacup, tucking the fragments of my sorrow into its hollow heart. When the cup brimmed full of paper petals, I carried it to the garden, where a magnolia tree rooted beside the riverbank, its blossoms soft as hope. I dug my fingers into the damp earth, broke ground for a modest hole, and set the cup inside, covering it with soil and planting a single sprig of lavender on top, a nod to the scent that once betrayed me but now reminded me that even bitterness can nurture beauty. As I patted the earth smooth, the rain gathered in gentle patter overhead, mingling with the tears I no longer fought, and I whispered to the buried pages, "You've had your say, and now it's time the story moves forward." In that quiet ritual, I felt a surge of something like lightness, a thrill that coursed through my veins and made each rib step softly toward a new day. I walked back to the house under a sky-washed silver, the heaviness in my shoulders gone, replaced by a calm I hadn't known since childhood summers. In the weeks that followed, I found myself humming old hymns not out of duty but joy, and I sat with new friends on that porch, passing around cups of real, safe coffee, laughing at small jokes and sharing small truths without shame. I even began writing again, not poems of poison this time, but stories of survival, of a woman who learned to bury her sorrow and plant hope in its place. When I sealed the first manuscript and sent it off to a publisher, my heart tapped out a quiet hymn of pride, knowing that at last I'd claimed the pen rather than let it tremble on the edge of fear. Darling, I chose that day to live forward, to fill empty mornings with purpose instead of dread, and to trust that kindness, though fragile, can heal wounds deeper than any poison. And let me tell you this, when you release what has bound you for so long, by burying a teacup, by tearing out a page, by forgiving that which you cannot change, you might just find the courage to bloom where you're planted, even in soil that once held your deepest pain. I've made my choice, to live unburdened, unafraid, and unabashedly free. Well, darling, if you'd asked me back in that hot South Carolina summer whether a soul could bend in half and still stand upright, I'd have poured you a cup of that violet-rimmed tea and told you it takes time to learn the shape of your own strength. Now that I'm 79 and have leaned on rivers of memory, I see the truth plain as magnolia blossoms against a stormy sky. Life's richest lessons don't arrive wrapped in pretty paper or polite blessings, but in the ragged moments when trust shatters and we find out whether we'll let that break define us or refine us. I once believed that kindness always circles back, that if you smiled sweet enough and bowed your head at prayer circle, goodness would come calling in a perfectly chilled pitcher of tea. Lord have mercy, how that notion tasted bitter once I felt those first tremors of poison in my veins and saw my own husband avert his eyes. But in the years since, I've learned that real grace isn't served in porcelain, it's forged in the furnace of adversity, hammered out by every tear, every sleepless night, every silent bow whispered into the darkness. When I stepped off that greyhound at the urging of fear and hope, I carried nothing but a battered suitcase and a stubborn ember of belief that there was more to me than the role I'd been handed. And oh, how that ember became a bonfire when I tutored those eager children, when I let my pen scratch into paper not just the horrors of betrayal, but the beauty of survival. The lesson I hold now, firm in these old bones, is that you cannot wait for someone else to remove the poison from your life. Sometimes you must bury the cup yourself, plant something brighter in its place, and water your own roots until they reach deep enough to draw fresh water from a kinder earth. I've come to understand that forgiveness isn't about forgetting or inviting old ghosts back in. It's about releasing the hold they have over you so you can breathe without fear. And resilience, sugar, isn't some fairy tale armor, it's simply the choice to rise again and again, even when every muscle aches with memory. If there's one seed I'd plant in your heart, it's this. Stop waiting for the world to bless you the way you expect. Don't sit on your porch hoping a safe future drifts over like a hymn on Sunday morning. You've got to stand, step into the unknown, and carry your own candle when the night closes in. Maybe it's time you stopped waiting for peace to come in a teacup and started stirring it up with your own two hands. Because if I know anything, and honey, I've learned these truths in the slowest, hardest school of all, it's that freedom blooms in the soil we choose to till ourselves, and the harvest is all the sweeter when we've sown it from the ashes of what once tried to take us under. Well, child, here we stand on the porch of memory. This gentle evening breeze carries the echo of cicadas and the soft hum of distant hymns as we close the final chapter of a story that began in Summerfield back in 1974 and braved betrayal, poison, fear, and the quiet courage required to bury a teacup in garden soil and plant hope in its place. I want you to feel the warmth of this moment not only as a conclusion, but as a fresh beginning for both of us, because though the past shaped me, it does not define the woman I stand before you today, 79 years old, still learning, still growing, still believing in the power of resilience. You see, I know there are hearts listening who have stared down their own storms, who have tasted the tang of tears in their morning tea, and who wonder whether the damage shall ever fade. This story might be rooted in white clapboard porches and vintage hymns, but its heartbeat echoes in every life that has felt the sting of unspoken betrayal or the ache of a promise gone cold. Back then I believed kindness always circles back, that if you bowed your head in the right prayer circle and sipped the sweetest brew, heaven would bless you in perfect measure. Lord have mercy, how that notion tasted bitter once I felt nettle and nickel slide down my throat and saw my husband avert his eyes, his gaze as empty as the space between gratitude and fear. I remember the hush of that stormy night. The clock in the parlor struck 2 as I pressed fingertips to my pulse, and the realization that the hands meant to protect me had become agents of my undoing. But in the years since, in quiet library aisles and moonlit walks by the James, I have learned that real grace isn't served in porcelain, it's forged in the furnace of adversity, hammered out by every tear, every sleepless night, every silent vow whispered into the darkness. I've learned that true love isn't about circling back to the same teacup in a familiar hand, but about the quiet courage to rise again, to find yourself in the echo of your own heartbeat. And what do you think? Should true love return? Or is it something that transforms into a gentle strength inside our hearts, guiding us forward rather than tempting us backward? This story you've heard isn't just replayed from old photographs or yellowed pages. It lives in the choices we make in this very moment, in the way we set boundaries, in the compassion we offer to friends who carry their own burdens, in the forgiveness we extend to ourselves. I want you to feel the weight of that purple china teacup dissolve into a memory of survival, so that when you face your own cups filled with uncertainty, grief, longing, you might recall that a single act of gentle release can open a path to renewal. Perhaps you've already buried your own silent relics somewhere deep inside, or maybe you're holding them tight because you fear what happens if you let them go. Yet tonight, as the fireflies begin their soft vigil and the porch light casts amber shadows on the boards, remember this: every story has room for one more chapter, and every heart can find a new beat if it dares to listen to its own voice. I'll carry the memory of David, of Margaret Ann's hymns, of that final stormy night in my soul, but I'll not carry bitterness beyond this twilight. Instead, I'll lean into the hush that follows confession, that gentle lull where healing takes root, where hope blossoms in unexpected soil. Sometimes, just sometimes, I feel he still remembers the warmth we once shared, and I find comfort in that gentle maybe. And though this tale began decades ago, it resonates today in our shared resilience, in the quiet choices that shape our days. Good night, darling, and God bless you always, sweet dreams.